bum, 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 bum. All right, welcome to the Brea Church of Christ, and we're going to do a new lesson in this this time called "Where Do I Start?" And this is really kind of going back in time a little bit because this is really a lesson that I do at the very beginning with most of my students. Especially, this is helpful if you don't know, excuse me, if you don't know your student real well and you're not quite sure how much Bible knowledge they have. So what this lesson deals with is what's called the 3 dispensations of the Bible. And it does many things. Number one, it kind of helps teach people, where do I start? In other words, if I want a relationship with Jesus Christ, this Bible is big. Where do I start? What part of the Bible is applicable to today's life. You would think a lot of people would know that, but the reality is there's a lot of people who don't understand. The second thing that it does, not only to show them, hey, we're going to study from a certain part of the Bible, and other parts of the Bible we're not going to deal with a whole lot. It explains to them why that is. Why are we going to do with this part of the Bible so much, and the other parts we're not going to deal that much with? The third thing it does is that it really helps you as a teacher to see where your student is as far as their faith and knowledge of the Bible. So you might see that, oh, okay, they don't know that much, which is okay. That's what this study is all about, is helping you, even if you have to start from the very basics. But it will help you as a teacher basically tell you, okay, I've got to go a little bit slower, and I've got to give kind of more of a basic concept here, or they know quite a bit, I can kind of move a little bit quicker. They understand a lot more. It helps you with that pace of study and understand your Bible student, how much they know or don't know. And then you can also use this as kind of you can give as much detail or as little detail as possible, whatever you think is important. Sometimes I'll use this as kind of a summary of the Bible and take my student from the very beginning all the way through and bring them kind of up to date. Kind of what is our law today? What is binding on us today? So this lesson is called Where Do I Start? Understanding the three dispensations of the Bible. And today we're going to go for 31 minutes, and then we're going to call it quits, and we'll pick up next lesson at that point. And so we're going to make it a two-part lesson here, and this is part number 1. So again, this is a evangelistic outreach, a teaching tool for the Brea Church of Christ here in North Orange County. Here's our address, phone number, our website. All of our video teachings can be found there. All of our sermons are on our YouTube page. If you just go to our website and just go to the left, you start pushing those buttons and kind of look around, all sorts of good Bible information that you can find. Give us a call, leave a message, send us an email. Love to hear from you. All right, so as we get started here, I want to start with this passage in the New Testament, 2 Timothy 2, and in verse 15. And here Paul writes to Timothy, and I don't say this very often, but I really do like the King James Version, their translation of this passage. And so I've used the King James Version, in which Paul writes to Timothy, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So the King James translates this as rightly dividing the word of truth. And so someone might be like, well, that's kind of strange. What do you mean dividing the word of God? Well, that's what this lesson is all about. It's going to show you how to rightly divide the word of God so that you understand how to use it properly. And that's another thing about this lesson. It really emphasizes that there's a proper use of the Bible and kind of gets you started along those lines, which is something I emphasize quite a bit, especially when I'm starting with a Bible student early on. So we're going to talk about how to rightly divide the word of truth today. So this lesson in video form, if it was put on a piece of paper, it would look like this. In fact, when I was preaching the gospel in Romania, I had no laptop, obviously no PowerPoint, and this was the lesson page I used and went through this lesson page with my students. So what you see on paper here, we're going to put in video format in this lesson. But one of the things I want you to notice is that you have these circles. This first circle is complete, right? It's a complete circle, represents what we call the first dispensation. And if you're not sure what do I mean by dispensation, hang tight, we're going to explain that in just a second. But the fact that it's a full circle means that that dispensation has been fulfilled. It is complete. You have a second dispensation, and it's complete. And here's our third, and you'll notice it's not a full circle. And that's because that's where I want to lead my student to, that this is where we're at today. This is the part of the Bible that is binding on people today. And so if I want to know how to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, what I believe, what I am to do and practice in my faith, it's going to be in this part of the Bible, because this dispensation is where we're at. It isn't complete yet. So here's a paper form, but let's do this in video format. So the first dispensation that we're going to talk about is called the patriarchal dispensation. And let's talk a little bit about that dispensation, and let's talk about what that word means. So when we use the term dispensation, it's for our purposes, what we mean by that is we're talking about a certain period of time in which a certain type of law or system of law was enforced, okay? You might put it this way. This is a period of time where God, sorry, I'm really dried out today, where God dealt with mankind in a certain way with a certain law. And we see in the Bible that you have the initial dispensation, the initial law, and then it changes twice. So there are 3 of these dispensations and 2 times where you see it all change. And when you see it change, that's where you have to rightly divide this dispensation from that dispensation, this law from that law. And so I hope that makes that word dispensation a little more understandable. So when we talk about the patriarchal dispensation, we're really talking about the period of law, the way God interacted with mankind, his creation, in the book of Genesis. The patriarchal dispensation starts from the beginning, Genesis 1, and goes all the way to Mount Sinai. So a little bit of the beginning of Exodus. But for the most part, you can think of the book of Genesis is that which records this patriarchal dispensation. So as you're reading through Genesis, you're reading through this period of patriarchal law, okay? Now, some characteristics of this dispensation. Number 1, there is no written law. You don't go to the book of Genesis and you see, like, okay, Abraham wrote down the law. No. There's no written law at this time, but there is a law. And we need to talk about that because that might seem weird. We're so used to our laws being in written form, right? But in this period of time, in this dispensation, there was no written law. The law was created within us. God put that law, and we can think of it as kind of, sometimes people call it a moral law, a sense of ought, a sense of right versus wrong. And so that sense of right, that moral code is built within us. It is a it's basically that feeling, this is right and this is wrong. This is sinful and this is not. And so it's pre-programmed with us. It's instinctive. Now, a couple things that you need to understand about that. Number one, even though it's pre-programmed in us, as people live their lives and as they grow up, they can reprogram themselves. And so they can reprogram them right out of God's moral code. So that where God says something is wrong, they would say, no, I don't believe that's wrong. I believe that's right. And so you can retrain yourself so that what's pre-programmed is now changed. Okay. Now, let me give you an example of this idea of this moral code pre-programmed in us. I always like to use this illustration. Imagine that you are walking your dog down the street on the sidewalk, this beautiful dog that is the jewel of your life, that gives you so much happiness and so much companionship. You're walking this dog down the street. And you see me approaching you, coming towards you, opposite end coming towards you. As you and I start to cross on the sidewalk, all of a sudden I kick your dog. I kick your dog hard. What's going to be your reaction? Your reaction is going to be one of shock. Your reaction is going to be, what are you doing? You're going to feel like I just did something completely wrong, socially embarrassed, but I'm not embarrassed. You're going to be like, what is wrong with you? And you're going to feel what I did was just that. It was wrong. Now, why do you feel that? Do you feel that because you've memorized your city's moral code or your city's ordinances, and there's an ordinance there that says you don't kick your neighbor's dog? No. You feel that because it's pre-programmed in you. That's what I'm talking about. There are things that people do, and it bothers us. And it's not because it's some written law somewhere. It's because God, our Creator, put it inside of us. And in fact, this is one of the great evidences that we are wonderfully created by an intelligent designer. How do morals be constant and then evolve in people? It is impossible to believe that or to explain it. But if you have an intelligent designer, it makes sense. And so during this dispensation, no written law other than the law written inside us. Okay? Now, God selected certain individuals to work through. And he gave them what we might say, a secondary law. He gave them instructions. He told them certain things to do or where to go or what to believe or what he was going to do with them. And when God worked in that way, God would speak directly to the people. And in most cases, God spoke directly to the fathers. And so what you see in this period of time is not only that God spoke directly to the fathers, but God wanted people to worship him and to serve him, to obey him. And so there was a religion at that time. And as you look at it, it was kind of a family religion. For example, God spoke to the father, Abraham. And Abraham became kind of the spiritual leader of the family. He became, if you want, the priest of the family. He would instruct them. He would build the altar. He would offer the sacrifices, maybe even mediate between the family and God. And so you have a period of time where God is working through certain families. The family of Adam, the family of Noah, the family of Abraham, and so forth. And so this is a good description of the patriarchal dispensation. The term patriarchal means father or forefather. And since God is speaking to the fathers, we feel that this is an appropriate description of this period of time of law. And so we call it the patriarchal dispensation. Now, as we look at this dispensation, as we look at the book of Genesis, what we find is that God is working through certain fathers and their families to bring forth a son that's going to come and reverse the, he's going to reverse the curse that came because of sin. And so God gives us certain hints that he's going to do that, but then at a certain time of all of mankind that is on the face of the earth, God selects one man that he's going to bring forth this seed or this son of promise. And God selects Abraham. And so we start learning about Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And God makes several promises to Abraham, 3 of them that we want to highlight. And there are 3 promises we call the seed promise or the son promise, a nation promise, and the land promise. And so they're all fulfilled physically in that order. First the seed, then the nation, then the land. So the seed promise comes about through Isaac. And there's an incredible story in the book of Genesis, how God promised that he was going to bring this seed, this son. But both Abraham and his wife Sarai were what? They were barren. And God miraculously gave them a son in their old age. And so Isaac is the fulfillment, the physical fulfillment of that seed promise. And then from Isaac comes Jacob. And Jacob is selected to bring forth the next fulfilled promise, and that is the nation promise. And so we read about Jacob having what? Not one son, but 12 sons. And these 12 sons of Jacob become the 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And then God is going to take them and take that nation, and he's going to fulfill the land promise. And he's going to bring them into the land of Canaan. Now, when the land promise is fulfilled, that's going to be another dispensation yet to come. So we're going to stop right here because this is the story that the book of Genesis tells us. God is working through all of this in this law, in this dispensation. And one further thing, to bring that spiritual seed, right? Isaac was the physical seed, but Jesus is the spiritual and the ultimate fulfillment of that Abrahamic promise. God selects one son of Jacob, one tribe to which that Jesus, that promised son, is going to come about. And so we read he selects the tribe of Judah. He uses the descendants of Judah to bring forth the spiritual son, who is Jesus Christ. All right, so now we get to the book of Exodus. And God's nation is not in the land of Canaan. They are slaves in the land of Egypt. And we get introduced to a deliverer. God's going to deliver them out of Egypt and lead them into the promised land. And so we know that's Moses. And so now we're getting to the book of Exodus. We're still in the patriarchal dispensation. But as Moses comes on the scene, things begin to change. And that's what we want to take notice of. And so what is it that starts to change? Well, now God speaks not to families through the Father, but he speaks to the one nation Israel through a mediator whose name is Moses. So God starts dealing with his creation, and especially this nation that he created, that he promised, in a different way. So we notice things are starting to change. So God starts dealing with the people as a nation, not through the family. And so Moses leads Israel to Mount Sinai, where what? A new law is given. So what happens? Things are changing. Now, one thing I want you to notice, what changes, the way God changes his dealings and how he deals with people, changes for only one nation, and that is Israel. All the other nations, God continues to deal with them under that moral code, under that patriarchal law, if you will. He still judges them by that moral code that's pre-programmed in them. But for Israel, we've got to make a distinction, okay? So let's talk about what changes at Mount Sinai. Number one, a new law is given. This time, the law is written down. And so as you look at what comes to be known as the law of Moses, that law now writes down that moral law that was only pre-programmed in us. In the law of Moses, it's now in written form. And so the moral law is part of the law of Moses, and it's now in written form. Now, also in that new law, there is ceremonial law, or what we might call religious law. There's also criminal law. It is all encompassing. And so there is with God, get this, no separation of church and state. Our own country made a huge blunder and mistake by misunderstanding the words of Thomas Jefferson, and therefore misunderstanding what is written in the Constitution, to where we had a separation of church and state. And as a result, our country has been greatly affected and greatly hurt in a moral way because of those mistakes. God never intended government and religion to be separate. And you see that in his law. So I'll get off my soapbox. I got on the soapbox there a little bit, but I think that's so important that people hear that word. Okay, so there's a new law. The law is now written down. And now the law is given not through the fathers. The law is not just ingrained in the heart. The law is given through a mediator, one man, Moses. And so God speaks to Moses, and Moses then speaks to the people, and Moses what? He writes it down. And so what you see is God starts dealing with mankind on a national level. But it's only one nation, the nation of Israel. All the nations, again, are judged by and dealt with through the patriarchal dispensation, through the patriarchal law. But now for Israel, God deals with them as a nation. And even some of the other nations, you see God dealing with them in that way as well. The prophets all have messages to the nations, to Edom and the Philistines and to Moab and so forth. So we have changes made. And so what do we have to do? We have to make a distinction. We have to rightly divide these two systems of law. And so we have the patriarchal period. No written law. God speaks to the fathers. God speaks directly, and it's a period of family religion. So what does Moses do? Moses leads them across the Red Sea. We're going to use that event as our dividing line. And he leads them after the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where God creates a new covenant and gives a new law. And things start to change. And so now we're going to make a division. And now we're going to separate the Mosaic dispensation or the Mosaic period from the patriarchal. So the Mosaic period, written law, not like the patriarchal period. Mosaic dispensation, God speaks to Moses and speaks to him directly, not like the patriarchal period where God spoke directly, but to multiple people, multiple fathers, to the patriarchs. And so the Mosaic period is a period of national religion. The nation worships God, not just the family. And so all of those changes, we've got to rightly divide the word. So we're dividing Mosaic from patriarchal. Now, let's face it, most people understand that. We don't have a whole lot of people going and saying, you know what? To be a Christian today, we got to build an ark just in case a flood comes. We don't have people saying, oh, you can't eat the fruit that's in the middle of the garden because God says that's forbidden. No, we understand that that was a different period of time, and we're not under that law. Those were commands given to people at that time. And so we have to make that distinction. And when it comes to the difference between Mosaic and patriarchal, people do. But when we get to the third dispensation, the Christian dispensation, then we're going to find out people don't make that distinction. People take things from the Old Testament and they bring them on into the New Testament. And we're going to show you why that's wrong. It's not rightly dividing the word when we do that. All right, so the Mosaic period. Let's talk a little bit about Israel's history, because the Mosaic dispensation goes from the book of Exodus all the way to the Gospel of John. As you're reading those books, the Bible characters and the stories you're reading are all written with people under the Mosaic law. They're all in that Mosaic dispensation. And so you got a period of time where Moses leads the people. After him, Joshua leads the people in the fulfillment of that third promise, the land promise. And so these two periods, especially the time of Joshua, is a period of very obedient people, or God's people, to God. The nation is obedient. Then you have a period where a generation in Israel comes about who do not know God, and they disobey God. And so God brings about the curses of the law. God brings their foreign enemies to win victory over them. And so the people cry out to God for help, for deliverance. And God sends them deliverers. A series of deliverers we call judges. And the judges bring the people, bring the nation back to God. Well, then the people want a king like all the other nations. The people want to be like the other nations. They don't want to be different or distinct. So God is upset because God wants them to be separate, distinct. He wants them to be the lesson and the message for the rest of the world. But God gives them what they want. He gives them a king. And so you have what's called the United Kingdom. You got King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. And then King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, makes a terrible mistake. And he ends up dividing the kingdom. And so you have the 12 tribes divided. 12 of them go to the north, to Israel. And then 2 of them stay to the south, and they take the name of the predominant tribe, and that's Judah. So Israel to the north, Judah to the south. Well, both Israel and Judah over time continue to be disobedient to God, and so God takes them into captivity. Israel goes into Assyria, and Judah goes into Babylonian captivity. But for Judah, after 70 years, they return. And so finally you have the return and the dispersion. So some from Judah come back to the promised land. They come back and they build up Canaan once again. But some from Judah and many from Israel, they don't return to the land of Canaan. They don't come back to the promised land. They go and they disperse out to the Greco-Roman world. And so this is what you have under the Israel's history of the Mosaic dispensation. So as you get to the New Testament, as we bring our lesson to a close, when you're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though you're in the New Testament, you're still under the Mosaic law. What do we have? Jesus being born a Jew under the Mosaic law. Jesus starting his ministry as a Jew. And then finally, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But as Jesus comes on the scene, he's under the Mosaic law. He's in the Mosaic dispensation. But what do you see? Things are starting to change again. And we have to make that division. And so there's our chart. We're right here. We're going to stop. In our next lesson, next week, we'll finish up this lesson with part 2. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in part number 2.